Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started. I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much for joining Columbia Riverkeeper today as we speak to award-winning author Joshua Frank about his book, Atomic Days, The Untold Story of the Most Toxic Place in America. My name is Simone Anter. I'm a staff attorney and the Hanford Program Director at Columbia Riverkeeper. And today I'm joined by Esteban Ortiz. Esteban, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, definitely. My name is Esteban Ortiz. I'm the program coordinator here at Columbia Riverkeeper. And today, today we are joined by Joshua Frank, a California-based journalist and co-editor of the political magazine Counterpunch. And he has also co-authored with Jeffrey St. Clair of several books, including The Big Heat, Earth on the Brink, and most recently he's authored, of course, Atomic Days. And we're here, the Untold Story of the Most Toxic Place in America. So thank you, everybody, for joining us on this Wednesday.
Yes, and for everyone joining us, please make sure as we talk to Joshua to send in your questions via the Q&A function, and we will do our best to get all those questions answered and leave, I think, around 20 minutes at the end. So definitely just keep those flowing in and we will answer them. But for now, I guess we can go ahead and get started with some of our questions and get the conversation going. So, Joshua, you start your book with a bit of an introduction about why you chose to write about the Hanford Nuclear Site. But for those listening who may not yet have read your book, could you provide some context here and talk a little bit about why this expose on Hanford and what personally inspired you to write this novel? And maybe also start with a little bit about you and your career as an investigative journalist.
Sure. First, thanks so much for having me and for everybody taking a little time out of their day to tune in. I went to college in Oregon, in Portland, and dating myself, but back in the late 90s, and I was aware of Hanford a little bit, sort of in the periphery. I was involved in some environmental stuff going on there and on the coast during the timber battles. But I didn't really understand what Hanford was. And then I ended up going to graduate school and read a couple books about Hanford and came away scratching my head wondering why this wasn't a bigger issue for this country, in particular the Northwest, where a lot of people still aren't really aware of what Hanford is. So I ended up sort of stumbling into journalism by accident. Sometimes that's how our careers come about. In about 2010, I was working for doing some freelance work, and I got a grant from the Nation Institute to do a couple pieces on Hanford for Seattle Weekly. And I ended up writing on two very big whistleblowers out at Hanford over the course of a couple of years. I wrote a couple stories and then a couple other pieces, and just kind of immersed myself in Hanford. And I was blown away. I was blown away by the lack of coverage. And I was blown away by the fact that we really didn't truly understand the history. It wasn't this story that's sort of told in the Northwest, even though it's this lingering problem. And then in the course of interviewing these whistleblowers, I became pretty alarmed about what Hanford was and is. And about 10 years later, I kind of revisited it, and I realized, man, a lot of things haven't changed since I first covered Hanford. And I pitched the idea as a book project, sort of to tell a people story of Hanford. There are some books written at Hanford, some very good books, but there's sort of this top-down histories, nothing that sort of told the story from the perspective of those that were impacted the most by the Hanford Project. And so I approached it from that perspective and did the best I could. Hopefully, everybody can read it and judge for themselves.
No, definitely. Thank you, Joshua. So I think the next question is, Hanford is the most toxic place in the world, and how is it that more people do not know about Hanford? And do you think that this is intentional by the government to maintain the secrecy at the site and limit public knowledge, or could you talk about the secrecy surrounding the Manhattan Project and the carryover today?
Yeah. Well, some of this might be repetitive for those that know a lot about Hanford, but I think it's important to have the context. So Hanford was one of the 3 main sites picked for the Manhattan Project. And Hanford was chosen largely because of its remoteness. And it was sort of out of sight, out of mind. It wasn't near a large urban area. And of course, the indigenous population and others that lived in and around Hanford were easily expendable to move them out, to move workers in to create this massive project. And Hanford is a very large area. It's over 180 square miles, or I'm sorry, 580 square miles. And it's kind of in this expansive no man's land in the way that we talk about it. But there were people living there. There was in the Yakima, the Umatilla, the Walla Walla. I mean, this was a very vibrant area for millennia. But the U.S. military saw it as an opportunity to exploit the people that lived there, and then, of course, to move in this massive project. So Hanford ended up producing massive amounts of plutonium. That plutonium was used in the Trinity test, in the Fat Man bomb as well, that was dropped on Nagasaki. And the first commercial plutonium produced in this country was produced out at Hanford at the B reactor. And those reactors out at Hanford, I think there was 9 total, operated from the early 40s up until the end of the Cold War, about 1987. So it produced a massive amount of plutonium, enough for over 60,000 warheads. It's just kind of unfathomable to think about how much plutonium was produced out there, 74 tons of plutonium. And unfortunately, the legacy that plutonium left is still lingering out there. I like to think about the World War II, the legacy of World War II still bubbling out at Hanford. There's 177 of these huge hulking underground tanks. 149 of those are single-shelled tanks. The waste that remains out at Hanford, some 56 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste, is sitting in these tanks. And these tanks were only supposed to last, in some cases, a couple of decades. So I went back into the files at Portland State University. Actually, they have the Hanford files. And shout out to any librarians out there. They're wonderful. And I went through and I found all these documents. You know, there was engineers and others for a long time warning, even before these tanks were built, that this is just a temporary stopgap. They don't have a permanent solution for where to put this waste. And the warnings were there very early on. But now fast forward, 80 years later, and the waste is still sitting there. And that's where we are today. It's still a very big lingering problem. We can get into a little bit of what those problems, what they pose to the Columbia River, of course, but even greater risks as well. We know that those tanks have been leaking. There's 67 documented leaks that have happened. 2 of the tanks right now are leaking. These tanks are only about 7 miles from the Columbia River. So what happens is, this waste in these tanks permeates into the groundwater. That groundwater slowly makes its way to the Columbia River. And in some cases, these 2 tanks that are leaking right now, they don't have a solution for what to do with them. In one case, they just put a tarp over top of it to hopefully stop the rain from coming in and pushing that waste further down into the groundwater supply. I mean, it's a catastrophe. I think about like the BP oil spill that we all witnessed, however long ago that was, over 10 years ago now. And we had that live footage, where the 24-hour footage of the gush of oil coming out, and everybody was concerned, and rightfully so, obviously. But we don't have that same concern about Hanford. We don't have a live camera down there that's documenting this leak. And part of the problem with that is, getting back to your question, which is that this is a very secretive site. Of course, it was secretive during its entire plutonium operation days during the Manhattan Project. But a lot of that secrecy has spilled over today, because, of course, it's a very dangerous place. There is high-level radioactive waste, so it does need some security in and around the facility. But as far as the cleanup goes, it's it's still really hard to penetrate the what is actually happening. And this is as you mentioned as well, this is the most toxic site in the Western Hemisphere, and it's also the most expensive environmental cleanup in world history that U.S. taxpayers are footing the bill for. Right now, the estimate is at about $677 billion. That estimate has been going up almost exponentially over the last 20 years. If I was a betting person, I would say that this is probably going to exceed $1 trillion by the end of the decade. And unfortunately, very little progress has been made in cleaning up the mess out at Hanford. And the whistleblowers I've talked to, everybody has the same goal in mind, that we need to get this site to a place where it's safe for the community, safe for the Northwest, and we're not there yet. Unfortunately, we use this term cleanup. I don't think Hanford will ever be clean, but I do believe that we can get it to a place that is not a lingering disaster that poses insurmountable risks to the Northwest and to the local communities there. So I'm really, really concerned about that. And just the amount of money that's being spent. Again, this exponential bill that we're putting the bill for is, it's a lot of money. But if that money was being spent and the job was getting done correctly, and those contractors that are out there were being held accountable, I think everybody would agree that it's money well spent. But unfortunately, right now, what we're seeing is a cleanup project that is highly profitable with very little oversight, very little accountability. And unfortunately, there's organizations like Columbia Riverkeeper and others that are working to hold these contractors accountable, and the Department of Energy, which is overseeing these contractors. So that secrecy, in large part, is because I believe that it is such a profitable enterprise that the more scrutiny these contractors have, the more liable they'll become to be accountable for the profits that they're making.
So yeah, so on that subject, how would you say the secrecy plays into the looming dangers to the Columbia River and the larger environment?
So, as we mentioned, the two tanks that are leaking are a looming danger that everybody ought to be very, very concerned about. As we all know, the Columbia River is the lifeblood of the Northwest. There's commercial fisheries along the Columbia. Waters feed thousands of Northwest farmers, and of course, just the recreation that it has as well. And the people that live along the Columbia River downstream, of course, Portland. There's a lot of impacts that can happen if the river becomes more and more radioactive. One of my big concerns that I was not aware of, one of the dangers that the waste in these tanks poses. One whistleblower, Donald Alexander, he was a now retired high-level DOE scientist, explained to me one of his biggest fears, which is that hydrogen buildup in one of these tanks, if it was ignited, could produce a catastrophic nuclear accident, unlike anything this country has ever witnessed. And there is precedent for this. Back in the 50s, Hanford sister facility in the then Soviet Union called Mayak had an accident in one of its waste tanks, and it was, by release of radiation, the third largest accident ever in the world. And most people don't know about it. And most people don't know about it because it was a secret plutonium production site for weapons, much like Hanford. After the end of the Cold War, the US sent a delegation of scientists and others over to Mayak to share information with the Russians and to learn about what they knew about the accident and what it did to those local communities there, where it eviscerated entire villages. There's pollution in lakes that can't be remediated. As a really kind of a desolate Chernobyl-like area that is off limits in some cases, where there's very high levels of radioactivity. Donald Alexander was part of that delegation and came back and became very, very concerned about a similar accident happening out at Hanford. And he explained to me that, the longer that this waste sits in these tanks, the more hydrogen that builds up in certain cases. And right now they have to off gas that hydrogen. If there is an accident, if something goes awry, which definitely can happen. I mean, we're talking about 177 of these tanks that they have to monitor. Not all of them are producing hydrogen, but a fair amount of them are. There could be some kind of explosion. That explosion could get up into the wind. It could spread across the United States. Certain communities, Richland and the Tri-Cities, may become unlivable. I mean, this sounds like, doomsday type scenarios, and I hope obviously it never happens, but it is a possibility, and it's a very frightening possibility. I think that it would have a domino economic effect. I think the Northwest economy would take a huge hit, and I think a lot of people would suffer. Many would die. So I'm obviously very, very concerned about the worst case scenario. But of course, we could see something really bad happen that's not the worst case scenario that could have all these same impacts, right? So there's a lot of issues. As long as that waste is out there, as long as the soil continues to be contaminated, we're in for it. And I really hope that people become aware of the threats that this place poses.
I think too, this is just the problem with nuclear waste and these past nuclear production sites is the waste is just very unpredictable in ways that I think we don't often talk about, and how to clean it up. A lot of times we don't know how to clean up certain types of waste, or the federal government doesn't. And especially with these tanks, when you think about how this was the place where they put the most toxic radioactive liquid waste from plutonium production. So basically the worst of the worst into these underground tanks. They didn't know what was going to happen in those tanks. And like you said, they have far exceeded their 20-year shelf life. And we're kind of dealing with the repercussions of that. We've talked to some folks in the past during our spooky webinar series about just some of the things that happen at Hanford that are so bewildering. And one of them was about a burping tank that just started bubbling and making noises. And, you talk about this story of one of those tanks that exploded. I mean, this kind of stuff happens, and it's not to be a doomsday scenario or anything. It's just really the unpredictability of nuclear waste. But
yeah, and in the case of these tanks, I mean, each one of these tanks has a different concoction of this toxic soups in them. So even people that study these tanks their entire careers aren't always aware of what's in them, right? And which is what's making it really hard to clean up these tanks as well, to vitrify what's inside of them, because they're all it's a complicated, mix of high level waste, chemical waste, all kinds of things. So that's part of what creates that unpredictability.
Definitely. So I want to go back to something you said a little earlier about your book being really a people's history of Hanford. I really love that. So you spend a good part of your book detailing, right, stories of people and their interactions with Hanford. And these range from people who have been exposed to toxic and radioactive pollutants on site to those who have blown the whistle about unsafe working conditions and contractor corner cutting in the cleanup. Could you talk about some of these stories and what stood out to you as you researched this book?
Sure. Well, I mentioned one whistleblower. I'll talk about another one in a second. But I think one thing that often gets left out of the story of Hanford, not only historically but present day, are the workers out there. These are some of the most dangerous jobs out there, and the secrecy surrounding Hanford makes those jobs even more dangerous. Unfortunately, Hanford Challenge up in Seattle that works diligently on worker rights issues out at Hanford. But unfortunately, there are a lot of cases where workers have been exposed to toxic vapors on the tank farms. I read about Abe Garza and another man, Lawrence Rouse, two workers who have lingering health impacts from being exposed out there. And time again, what we've seen is after the fact, they get exposed to something, a small accident happens, they uncover an area that was radioactive they didn't know was radioactive. I mean, there's so many scenarios where these workers are exposed or put in danger And so talking about their stories in particular, I think is really relevant and important, because if we're going to get this cleaned up, the workers are going to have to be integral in that, and the workers should be as protected as possible. The other whistleblower that I interview, his name is Walter Temasitis, and Walt is a wonderful guy. He and I probably don't agree on a lot of politics and those kind of things, but we both agree that Hanford is in really bad shape. Walt was a contractor for a company called URS, which operates under Bechtel, and a high-level engineer who blew the whistle on something that was happening at the waste treatment plant. The waste treatment plant, for those of you that aren't aware, is this huge construction project that Bechtel is building. It's the at one point, I'm not sure if this is still true, but it was the largest construction project in the country at one point. I think it's on, aspects of it are on hold at the moment. But there's been, I think, $60 billion that's been spent so far on this project. And the WTP, is the waste treatment plant, is supposed to one day take this waste from these tanks, heat it up, turn it into glass in a process called vitrification, and then they'll be able to store these glass rods in a place that's safe. Right now, they fired up this test run for low-level radioactive waste, and hopefully it works. They've put all their eggs in this basket, and I think there's a lot of reasons to stick with the plan to vitrify. But in the process of doing the building an aspect of the waste treatment plant, Walter Temasitis said, wait a second, I think something's not going to work here. They were going to put this waste into this area that they would no longer be able to access. So if there was an accident in one of those in capsules, essentially, you could see a hydrogen explosion, for example, or a really catastrophic thing, and you wouldn't be able to go in there and take care of it. So Walt really, was worried about this, and he thought, I'm going to go through the normal routes. I'm going to raise concerns, and every step of the way, he had pushback from management, because the longer that they drew all this out, the less profit incentive they would meet. So if Bechtel, for instance, didn't meet timelines for things, they didn't get their bonuses. And the contracts out at Hanford are something called cost plus contracts. So it's kind of like if you hired a contractor to come and remodel your kitchen or do some work at your house, and they say, oh, it's going to cost $500, but when all said and done, it's $1,500 or something. Well, multiply that by billions, and that's what's been going on at Hanford. And Walt was really concerned about this. He thinks that this sort of for-profit cleanup is a detriment, especially when taxpayers are paying for it. So all along the way, he gets shut out. He ends up essentially getting fired. He ends up suing. He wins. It was a long ordeal, years-long ordeal, multiple lawsuits. But Walt was ruined. I interviewed him for some of those early stories for Seattle Weekly, and then I caught up with him later to see how he was doing. And unfortunately, he wasn't doing very well. I mean, he was struggling with losing his entire career. I mean, he really believed in what he was doing. He believed in the importance of the work. He believed that Hanford ought to be cleaned up, and he lost everything. So yeah, he got a settlement at the end of the day, but that didn't, bring back his career or his purpose. And his story, I think, is emblematic of a lot of people out there. And unfortunately, I think the environment out at Hanford and the workers there that I've talked to, they continually tell me how hard it is to speak out because of those risks, the risk of losing their career, especially younger workers that might have a young family or mortgage or those kind of things. It's not an environment that fosters, accountability or whistleblowing. And Walt and Donald's stories were examples of that, as well as workers like Abe Garza and Lawrence. I mean, these are men, and not just men. There's women that work out there too that have been faced with insurmountable problems and have very little recourse. There's been some good legislation that's passed in Washington State But it hasn't gone far enough in protecting these workers, and if they get sick decades later after they leave the job to get compensation, those sorts of things. So it's a constant problem. So that's one aspect of the people's story, and the other aspect, of course, is historically, especially the impact on the indigenous communities out there. And we can talk a little bit about that. But I write about one I would say Hanford hero. There's not many. Russell Jim of the Yakama Nation. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Jim a couple of times when I was doing some of those Seattle weekly pieces. And he just told me a story that is very familiar to those that understand the history of America in the US. But in some ways, Hanford encapsulates everything that is wrong, in my view, with the United States. It was built on stolen land. It was a military production site that was responsible for fuel that was used in an atomic bomb, and now it's a lingering disaster. All right, what's more American than all of these things? And Russell really explained that to me, and his legacy lives on. I mean, the native tribes have a seat at the table in large part because of the work that Russell Jim did. So I also write about him as well, and these are stories that those that are entrenched in Hanford know, but I don't think a broader public has much awareness of.
Well, thank you, definitely. And the big thing out there is the delay, and it has been noted that the contractors who are asked with the cleanup, keep giving those excuses. And can you talk more about this? And what do you think that the government will ever fully admit that the technology for the cleanup does not exist, and of course hold Hanford contractors accountable?
Yeah, I think at the nucleus of the problems out at Hanford is lack of accountability. These contracts are very complex. The contracts are gargantuan. Both sides of the aisle, Representative Newhouse out there in Eastern Washington State, and then of course even Democrats like Pat Murray and others continually fund Hanford, which funding Hanford is one thing, but if there isn't accountability along with it, what kind of progress are we really going to be making out there? I think that there needs to be, there should be public hearings. We should have congressional investigations and congressional hearings. I write a lot about these contractors that get dinged by the Government Accountability Office and others for not getting the job done. There's been multiple times where they've been fined for overcharging taxpayers, but they just pay their fine and they move on and they continue to do the same thing over and over again. So where's the accountability? These contractors can really run the show out there. Donald Alexander, who worked for the DOE that I mentioned a couple of times now, he really explained to me one of the big problems is the Department of Energy, which is really responsible for overseeing every aspect of the cleanup, is completely understaffed. And this was 10 years ago. Of course, it's just gotten worse. Trump defunded the Department of Energy. The Biden administration, unfortunately, hasn't rebuilt it. So what that does is it creates an environment where contractors get to call the shots out at Hanford. And when they get to call the shots, the government has really little oversight, which means us as the public even has less oversight or less understanding of the process and what's going on out there. We see the bills, we cut the checks, but unfortunately we don't get to see much progress. And so I think for things to radically change, we need to change that dynamic. In a perfect world, I think that we would have to see the government taking over the entire project and not contracting this out to private contractors. Bechtel in particular is a privately owned company. They don't have shareholders. I think that Hanford, in large part, we need to put the same effort into cleaning this thing up as we did into the Manhattan Project to begin with. I think it's going to take international community of experts, physicists, and others to think outside the box. And I think resources need to be put into that. And I think that's the only way we're going to get this thing moving forward. Is if these private contractors continue to run the show out there, I don't have a lot of hope for Hanford.
Thank you for that. And you kind of keep touching on this point, but could you talk a little bit more about the interactions between militarism and capitalism and how you see that? Like Hanford is the perfect kind of example. I mean, Hanford's the perfect example for a lot of these interactions, you say.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I write a little bit about the history of these contracts, and I think it's kind of important to understand that Hanford, I sort of see it as like a subcategory of the permanent war economy. I call it the permanent disaster economy, which is sort of like the subcategory of the permanent war economy. That we poured all this money into Hanford for all those years, producing all this plutonium, and all the waste that came from that production is still out there. And now that disaster, that cleanup, is extremely profitable, even though very little progress is being done, even though it's a looming danger. So it's interesting, you know. I think that as long as that cleanup, just like the war economy itself, and the Pentagon spending, as long as there's a profit incentive, wars will continue, weapons productions will continue, and Hanford and future Hanfords will be made, because profit, unfortunately, rules all, and capitalism is very integral to the Hanford project itself. And again, like unless we can separate that profit incentive from the cleanup, I don't have a lot of hope. And I want to have more hope.
Yeah, so I know there's some questions out there about this. So history versus science. You know, recently 2 movies are out that focus on the issue. Of course, Oppenheimer, and the other one is Einstein and the Bomb. It's on Netflix. The correlation in Oppenheimer and Einstein was that the fear was unknown. And history is about understanding of the world and appreciation of human diversity. Science is the discipline that focuses on studying natural phenomena. I would just say that in order to understand and educate about Hanford, which is subject needs to be emphasized, or do both need to be?
Mm. That's a really great question. I think, you know, the science out at Hanford is very complex. And there's experts that are working on all kinds of different things out at Hanford. Very good people working out at Hanford. You know, as I rail on the profit incentive and these contractors, that doesn't mean that there aren't really intelligent, great people working out at Hanford that are putting their lives on the line and their careers on the line. But I don't think we need to understand the physics at a doctoral level to understand that Hanford's in big trouble. And I do think that we need to understand that Hanford is in trouble, and in order to do that, we need to unravel the history. So I think your question is, the answer to that is that we need to understand both in some context. You know, Oppenheimer obviously was the movie of last year, right? It was a blockbuster hit. It left a lot of questions, not only about the U.S.'s responsibility, but it didn't really tell the story of the impact of the testing that went on in New Mexico, for example, near Los Alamos, and the impact that had on land and on locals and indigenous populations there, lingering effects to this day. And the same goes for Hanford. I mean, we don't know a ton about the lingering impacts of what's happening now, let alone the history of Hanford. We know quite a bit. But there weren't long studies done of the impacts that Hanford and intentional release of radiation, for example, and other accidents that happened over time. We don't know a lot of those impacts. We know some of them, but I think that they're much greater than we're aware of. And there's a reason for that, of course, because the government doesn't want us to know, let us in on a lot of those troubles. But to go back to your question, I think in order to understand Hanford on a basic level, we don't need to understand the process of fission on a PhD level to understand that waste that process produces is a waste that we live with forever. To put in perspective, the radioactivity of plutonium sticks around for about 250,000 years. You know, that's a really, really long time. That's a lot longer than humans have been roaming outside of Africa, for example. So that we don't have to understand science that much to understand that that's a risk. It's a risk that is kind of an insurmountable risk, and it's kind of hard to wrap our head around. But I think with that, we should understand how important it is to get this place cleaned up enough, or in a place that generations from now and our kids' kids, you know, can live next to this site and not be worried about what's going to happen there.
I think that's a really great point. I think that's something too you come up against a lot with Hanford insiders, is like this wall of technical understanding that you hit. And I mean, I think you said it right. You don't have to be a technical expert to understand what's at stake if this cleanup doesn't happen, how polluted it is, and that things need to change in order for a cleanup to happen. So thank you for that.
And I think it's also important to understand, you know, science is always evolving, right? I mean, so that's another thing. This isn't a static thing. I mean, we've learned so much even about impacts of radiation, for example, over time. I mean, what they've learned after the bomb and after all this testing. I mean, we know a lot more than we did then, and I think that's also important, that this isn't like a stagnant problem. That Hanford and the understanding of Hanford can evolve.
Absolutely. So I do want to switch gears a little bit and let's talk about small modular nuclear reactors, or SMNRs. Your book emphatically concludes that SMNRs are not an answer to the climate crisis, nor that they should be built at Hanford. Could you please explain this?
Sure. You know, I spent a lot of time on the book talking about waste. So waste kind of brought me to the realization that this idea that we're going to roll out all of these new reactors to solve the climate crisis is going to pose an insurmountable problems that we still don't have an answer for. I mean, we don't have a place to put the waste. And when learning about Hanford, also they're planning to build a small modular reactor out there right now. And I think we were just talking about it a little bit ago, but Washington State is throwing $25 million to pilot project with Energy Northwest, I believe, to build one of these small modular reactors out there. And there's a number of them that they want to do up and down the Columbia River. The company NuScale, which is out of Portland, they originally wanted to do something in Oregon, but back when the Trojan facility shut down, there was a Measure 7 that was passed in, I think, 1980, that said no new nuclear reactors could be built in the state of Oregon unless there was a place to put all of this waste, a permanent repository. Well, there's not one, and there isn't one anywhere in the world right now. So the NuScale guys said, oh, well, let's just move it across the Columbia River over into Washington. We'll build them there. They don't have this law in the books, even though they're trying to change legislation in Oregon. They haven't been successful yet. They said, oh, we'll just move across the border. These SMRs, they need water. They need to have water from the Columbia River to cool down the reactors. Of course, the proponents of this, backed by the Department of Energy, are saying these are safer than these old reactors. They don't produce as much waste as these old reactors, but the technology is the same. It's on a smaller scale, but it is the same. These reactors pose the same risks. In per megawatt produced, they will produce more waste than larger reactors. It's very expensive. They can't roll these things out on time, in time to have any kind of impact on the climate. It's a total waste of money when we have a lot more things at our disposal right now to combat the climate crisis. So, you know, there's a number of reasons I think small modular reactors are a horrible idea. But in the end, it comes down to waste. We don't have a place to put this waste. They want to put it out where the waste is still sitting in these casks along the Columbia River near Trojan. But, you know, as people that live in the Northwest know, this is a subduction zone. There could be a horrible earthquake one day. And that waste will likely still be sitting there. And what kind of problem is that going to pose? Not to mention, trucking this waste up and down the Columbia on rail or on barge. What do you, I mean, there's so many problems that can happen. I mean, we all know that trains derail. We all know that ships hit bridges, right? There's so many problems that could happen. I mean, just imagine if that ship that struck the bridge in Baltimore was carrying high-level atomic waste, right? What potentially could have happened there? You know, these are the things that we need to think about. At the end of the day, the climate crisis is very, very real. We ought to all be concerned about it, but we shouldn't be rolling out solutions to the crisis that are going to create another crisis down the road. So I think we need to do a cost-benefit analysis when we're looking at any kind of technology to help mitigate the climate crisis.
No, thank you. And just, you know, also like you're right about the downwinders. You know, I used to hang out every Friday at Tom McHale and Brew Pub there in Richland, but my favorite one was Margarita Active Ghost. You know, really enjoyed talking to the staff, which was the best way to find out about Hanford. You know, the Tri-Cities community is really starting to be more critical about Hanford. But would you say that not only should the local community, but the whole Pacific Northwest community need to come together in collaboration with the Native American community to hold the federal agencies accountable?
Absolutely. Richland is I grew up in Montana. I grew up in a Billings, Montana, and Richland really reminds me of Billings. It has a much different legacy, but it's the same type of people that live in Richland, that live in Billings. And I connect with those people. I was one of those people, and I love talking to people. And going to the brew pub on a Friday night is a good way to do that. You know, there's still this legacy of celebrating the atomic age that permeates the culture in Richland. You know, the local mascot at the high school are the Bombers. It has a R with a giant mushroom cloud exploding out of it. You know, it's kind of an eerie, weird place in that respect. But things are changing. There's a little movement at the high school there to change the mascot. There's I think a reckoning, especially among the younger generation, to come to grips with their towns and their cities' history and what that bomb did to the Japanese, not to mention to their own backyard. So I think for those that might live in Portland or Seattle or other communities, you know, we can't forget that these rural communities and the people that live in and around these areas want the same thing ultimately, to live in peace and not next to a lingering disaster. And fortunately, there's great organizations like Columbia Riverkeeper, which I'm so grateful for, Hanford Challenge, as I mentioned, the Yakima Environmental Restoration Management Program. There's so many people on the ground, grassroots efforts that are happening and ongoing, and I think tapping into those and supporting those grassroots activists is vital, so that we can someday have accountability that we need out at Hanford.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I just want to point out our chat has been blowing up with everybody's questions. And so I think I will ask one kind of final question before we turn to all those, because I don't think we'll be able to answer all of them in the remaining time. But I guess our last question from Riverkeeper is like, what do you hope people take away from your book at the end of the day?
I just wanted the book to be the small sort of contribution that it wasn't supposed to provide all the answers for Hanford, but to give insert a different type of context about the legacy of Hanford. So I hope people just can take away that this thing not only is a lingering disaster, but to understand the history in a slightly different way. That it wasn't just about the Manhattan Project that created the bomb that ended World War II, that in fact, the people suffered along the way and continue to suffer today. And how do we mitigate that? How do we reverse course? And I don't think we fail to, if we fail to understand history, we're doomed to repeat it, right? So I think it's really important for us to just have a better understanding of the US's real nuclear legacy. You know, and Oppenheimer, the film, did a little bit to do that. It missed the boat in so many ways. So, you know, the book might contribute in a small part to that, and I really appreciate you having me on to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking with us. I mean, I think, you know, Hanford, it's a multi-generational cleanup. The timeline extends very far. I think to keep talking about Hanford, especially from the perspective of people and those stories, is extremely important. So thank you for your work and speaking with us today. And before we turn to the Q&A kind of questions, for those fired up after our conversation and looking for ways to take action and stay involved in Hanford cleanup, I really encourage you to check out Columbia Riverkeeper's Take Action page and sign our petition, urging Washington and Oregon senators that nuclear power is not the answer to the climate crisis. You can read more on our website following that QR code. The second way is to continue to stay up to date on the latest. You can check out our Hanford resources page of the website. This has the latest updates, our latest technical comments, as well as resources like our interactive story map, which is called Waters Walk Through Hanford. It's a fictional story about a drop of water's journey across Hanford, where you can read and learn about Hanford's WESIF facility, tank farms, the 100N area, and the 100K area. It's available in both English and Spanish, and it's a great learning tool for all ages. If you haven't checked that out, I highly encourage. And then lastly, for those looking to support our Hanford work further, the best way is to become a member of Riverkeeper today. You can do that in a couple of ways, with a one-time donation or a recurring contribution on our website or over the phone. And we do have a link to our donate page shared in the chat or on the screen, I believe. So yeah, let's turn to some of these questions. I think we got around 30 questions, Joshua. Folks really want to talk to you more about Hanford. Esteban, I will let you go ahead and ask the first question, and we will try to get through as many of these as possible, but recognize we won't get through them all. So thank you, everyone, for putting those questions in.
Okay, so let's start with a question from Pam Cooley that says, I'm going to be visiting the Hanford site in April. White Bluffs hike and a tour of the site. Do you know if it has any radioactive exposure possibilities? And of course, they love your book.
Oh, thank you. I'm probably the wrong person to ask if it has any radioactive possibilities. I think generally things are pretty safe out there when you're walking around in the designated areas that they allow you to walk around in. I know the B reactor, which was open for public tours for a long time, there were some areas in the B reactor that were radioactive. So, you know, I think be cautious, don't stir up dirt, don't go off path, and listen to the guides that might be out there letting you visit.
Absolutely. Don't dig any holes, but generally safe. We do tours out there in the White Bluffs and hiking and go on river quite often. So generally safe in those areas. So we had a question actually come over email before the start of the webinar, and this is from Melinda. So over at least 5 decades, the greatest problem other than the nuclear waste itself continues to be accountability of government overseers and watchdogs. What can be done to improve accountability of government, both federal and state? And that is a huge question. A lot of these are, so definitely take whatever piece you'd like.
You know, I'm not an organizer. I don't work for an environmental group, but I do think that our first line of defense is our elected representatives. Contact, if you live in Washington or Oregon, contact your local representatives. And a lot of this stuff can happen at a very local level. I was talking to some folks in Spokane a few weeks ago. They're starting with talking about this issue with their city council. You got to start somewhere. So I think that's really important to have your voice heard, and using these nonprofits like Columbia Riverkeeper, become a member and use them as a conduit. They're doing great work. They keep up on the day-to-day stuff that's going on out at Hanford, and building them up will help hold those out at Hanford accountable.
Definitely. And I think, Hanford is often out of sight, out of mind for politicians. So reminding them that we care about Hanford, that we remember it's there and it's causing lots of environmental and health problems to people, and that people live near Hanford and care about Hanford and have sacred land being affected by Hanford. At the end of the day, just don't stop talking about Hanford and pushing for cleanup and for funding that cleanup. All right, Esteban, you want to ask the next question?
Sure. This is from Jean, and I'm sorry, don't want to pronounce your last name wrong, but can you speak more about glass vitrification? And I thought that it had finally started a decade later and was a big answer to the waste. So, and can you
Yeah,
just kind of talk about that?
sure. So for those that understand what vitrification is, it's essentially taking this waste out of the tanks and turning it into glass after heating it up to a really high temperature. The problem has been, as we talked about, that the contents in these tanks is very complex. So it's not like just taking one thing and turning it into glass out of every one of these tanks. It's much more complicated than that. Vitrification has been very effective at other sites. So it's, there's a lot of information about vitrification, and happy to share information in the chat about that. But from a very kind of basic level, they've been putting so much effort into building this waste treatment plant, into doing vitrification, that among most of the scientists, they still believe it's the best route forward. There has been some talk about grouting this waste. That was something they talked about decades ago and realized it was a bad idea, but it's a cheaper idea, so they're talking about it again. But ultimately, I think vitrification is the way forward, and I think it holds the most promise.
And two, for this type of waste, this high level waste is what we're talking about needing to be vitrified through the vitrification process. Legally, high level waste must be turned into glass and deposited into a deep geological repository. So in order to get around that, we have seen efforts from the Trump administration to relabel what they consider high-level waste and relabel tank waste to low-level waste in order to get around that and grout this waste. So when you're kind of seeing all the news about these issues, they all intersect. But legally, high-level waste has a way to be dealt with. And I think you mentioned this. The problem is the VIT plant, I think they have now just started up firing some test batches. So it's way behind schedule. And then we do not have a deep geological repository. But those continue to be the safest way to deal with this type of waste. All right, so another question we have, the Government Accountability Office did a body of work on Hanford in the 1980s and 90s, documenting much of what you found. Little accountability resulted, costs continue to increase, risks also. There isn't a lack of information, and what seems to be lacking is a focus and commitment to getting this job done. What are your views so we're not talking about these same issues 40 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, I think in order for us to not be talking about this in the same way 40 years from now, we have to have radical change out at Hanford. I think that the whole operation needs to be rethought, and not the scientific engineering process of how to clean up the waste, like the vitrification, but the management, the for-profit incentive, the way the DOE, the Department of Energy, oversees the project, input from community groups. I think that there needs to be a lot more transparency and accountability. And I don't have all the answers of how we get there, but we definitely need that. And I think we need to think about that as a community in order for that to happen. So that's my hope. I just hope that there can be more accountability, and that's the only way that this won't be a lingering problem 40 years from now. I mean, 10 years ago, we could be having this exact same conversation, and I hope that's not the case, 10 years from now.
Sometimes, unfortunately, with Hanford, the more things change, the more they also stay the same. But yes, I too hope that we are not talking about these same issues in 40 years. So some other questions we have are about some of the groundwater and plumes of pollution reaching the Columbia River. I can address that. And then if you found any of that in your book, we'd love to hear from you as well. There are lots of plumes of different pollutants and radioactive and toxic pollutants that do reach the Columbia River in certain spots. There is an online tool that actually you can go and look at different monitoring wells on site, all virtually from your computer. It's called Phoenix. You can pull up those wells and see how high the pollutants, various pollutants are in them. And you can look at ones that are close to the river and see what they're picking up. Our advocacy director, Dan Sayers, and I did a great tutorial on how to use Phoenix for anyone out there interested. You can find that on our Hanford resources page. And then also, every few years, the Department of Energy releases updated maps that show the groundwater plumes color-coded by pollutants, which ones are reaching the river, and where other ones are moving to. So there are lots of resources available online to see those maps, and they're also linked on our website as well. Yeah. So we have about 3 minutes left. I don't know if we want to keep asking questions, or Joshua, if you had any kind of last words that you wanted to wrap with. I realize we just kind of scratched the surface on all these questions, but
Yeah, I mean, I think, this could be a whole semester long course to talk about some of these things, right? So it's hard
definitely.
to fit it in. No, I think that ultimately just being concerned about Hanford, talking about Hanford with those your neighbors, others, especially if you live in the Northwest. I mean, I think that it's really important for people to know about Hanford. It's really amazing to me that people across the United States don't know about Hanford, let alone, in Seattle or Portland or, in Spokane, anywhere, or Boise. I mean, Hanford is the biggest threat to the Pacific Northwest, and so many people don't know about it. So I think just talking about it is really, really important, so that the only time we have really social change in this country is when there's a grassroots movement that gains steam, and that comes from more and more people becoming aware and becoming active. And so that's really, I think, crucial to the future of Hanford. And I hope that's the takeaway, is that you continue to educate yourself and continue to talk about this. Continue to support those that are working on this, and hopefully one day we can make some real change out there.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Joshua, for spending the hour with you and with us, well, with yourself too. And for folks who haven't yet read the book, I really do hope you grab a copy and check it out. It is a wonderful read, which I don't always say about Hanford related reads. So definitely check it out. And for a few lucky winners who RSVP'd to this webinar, we will be raffling off a few copies. So keep an eye on your email for that. But thank you again to Joshua, and thank you to our audience for participating. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.